Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I am your founder, Michael Manley, and your host, and I'm happy to welcome my friend, Eric Gladstone, to the podcast this week. And Eric is the founder of the Feast of Friends, which is a marketing firm focused on chefs and food, and we're both fellow foodies here in Las Vegas. And he's also the author of a new book called Anything But Nirvana, which is an exploration of the 90s music scene and his history as both kind of a critic and observer. And yeah, that's great of that whole scene. So we have this interesting shared love of music and food. And I thought Eric would be a great guest to bring on. So welcome, Eric. Thank you so much for being here.
Michael, thank you for having me. It's always great to talk with you, and it'll be nice to have one of those conversations shared with some other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you start by talking about your connection to music and how you got into music journalism, and especially the focus that you had, which was, I believe, on punk and sort of grunge music, would you say? Or
a little bit, yeah. Alternative music in the 90s was a big focus, at least in terms of the book. I did write about a lot of roots music. I'm a big fan of funk music and R&B and soul in a big way. So I wrote about that a bit too, but there were so many great writers in that field. I ended up professionally focusing a little bit more on alternative, although I did do a lot of other root stuff. So it's funny, my background comes up because my mom just recently told the story of how she started me on music lessons, apparently when I was in the crib. And there was music playing, I would rock back and forth to the rhythm of the music. And she noticed when the music changed, how I rocked would change. She's like, oh, okay, he's got some kind of musical acumen. And so she started me on violin at the Eastman School of Music, actually, because we lived in Rochester, New York. I get to brag that I attended Eastman.
As like a 4-year-old.
As a 4-year-old, yes, learning the Suzuki method.
Nice.
And my first recital was at 5, I think, and I was sawing away at something. So I played violin sort of off and on. We moved away from Rochester after a couple of years, and then I took lessons where we moved to in Connecticut. And I played off and on throughout my childhood. I sort of had I had a kind of a not great relationship with it, partially because I was playing on a very old violin, and I think that was hard for me to really get where I needed to get. It didn't have great tone. It didn't have great tone. It fell out of tune very easily, and it was a little frustrating. I played piano. I learned piano for about a year also, so I know the rudiments of piano. I can barely still read music, I guess, if you held a gun to my head. But then at 14, I discovered punk rock, and I switched from violin to bass. And like I was telling you earlier, originally I looked at a bass guitar and I thought, oh, it's the same strings as violin. This will be easy. And then I realized it's on a different clef, and of course the strings are actually transposed, but the basics are the same, and that was enough for me to not be intimidated by it, because my older brother played regular guitar, and I was just intimidated by that, and which is funny to think about, because technically I was more accomplished as a musician than he was. So I got on bass. I learned to play like listening to the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, which is, as easy a lesson and as big a confidence builder as you can get as a musician, because it's just so easy.
Like 2 chords or something.
And to this day, it cracks me up. You'll see so many sort of quote unquote professional bass players who are doing absolutely nothing on stage and posturing like they're doing something, the Michael Anthony's of the world, not to call him out or anything. But I was a fan of John Entwistle, in The Who was probably the best, or was probably the best, most accomplished rock bassist that ever lived, other than maybe Pino Palladino. Is incredible. and I did get to a point where I could play his solo from my generation, which is, a pretty great solo.
Yeah.
So, I was into it, but I never saw myself really as becoming a professional musician. I don't think I really had that in my sights. I don't think my family, middle class family, was really looking for me to do that. And I think I was smart enough to know also that was a long climb upward, which would take a lot of work and an equal amount of luck. So even in college, even in high school, I started getting interested in journalism. And of course, writing about music was the thing I was most passionate about. I was reading about music as a fan. This is going back to the late 70s, dating myself, and finding writers like Lester Bangs, J.D. Considine, now I'm zoning on other guys who I'm even friendly with now. Bill Holdship was a great one. David Brown as an entertainment writer, I've always admired. I'm going to think of other ones as I go along. But, I really enjoyed the creative writing about music, even Tom Wolfe's early stories about music. And a lot of the new journalism from the 60s and 70s was really inspiring. And I thought, how cool, because it heightened your experience and it made you understand more about the music than just the music, and this is a very much a pre-internet world, where information was really hard to come by. I would go to the library and luck upon finding books about music, and I would just dissect them. I'm ashamed to say, I would even sometimes cut the pictures out of these library books. Shame on me.
Yeah.
Because there was just nowhere else to get this stuff. It was absolutely inaccessible.
And music journalism, therefore, had a bigger role for sure, right? Or it was.
Yeah. So it felt like, I think I've always had a sense of, I wanted to do something that not necessarily got me noticed, just got me noticed in a narcissistic sense, but I always felt like I wanted to do something that made a difference on some level. And that's not necessarily saving the world, but at least like making a mark, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I felt like it was more likely to make a mark writing about music than creating it,
Interesting, yeah.
So, and then in college, I started off studying journalism, and then I wasn't impressed by the journalism school at Rutgers. Sorry. And so I quit that and just joined the paper at Rutgers. The newspaper at Rutgers predated the journalism school there. It's one of the oldest college newspapers in existence. And so they were an independent entity that was totally staffed and run by students.
Interesting.
And supported by the college, supported by student fees, but completely independent. So it was really, it was a business, and so I just eventually, I think I didn't get into my sophomore year, figured out, or I got in during the summer or something. But I eventually got in there, and I just literally learned on the job how to do everything you were supposed to do. I had a couple mentors there, one of whom is Nick Gillespie, who's a podcaster himself and works for Reason Magazine. He's always been a mentor, and I admire him greatly. And he that's how I learned, writing about music there, and that led directly to me starting to discover the music scene around us in New Jersey at the time, and that led to a lot of things that are in the book, actually.
Yeah. And so your book focuses a lot on alternative music and would you call it punk music or grunge music or whatever was happening mostly in the 90s, right?
Yeah, it starts in the end of the 80s. Book-wise, it starts in the end of the 80s. I was writing a tiny bit before that. It goes through to the aughts a little bit, but it's mainly the 90s. That was sort of the heyday of my writing about music, and I really felt that was, when I was putting this book together and sort of looking for a focus, I really feel like that was the last era of the sort of rock mythology or something, if you will, of rock as the overriding form of pop music, and that sense of having an importance to music, having a message in music that came up starting with rock and roll in the 50s, but really starting in the 60s. I think the 90s was the last gasp of that. And even though rock continues in a form now, I admire a lot of the bands. I like a lot of current bands. I don't see people quoting lyrics from Florence and the Machine or the Killers or Arctic Monkeys really in 30 years from now,
Yeah.
The way that people rhapsodize about Dylan and the Beatles seem to be as popular now as they ever were, which is crazy when you think about it. The revival of the interest in the Beatles is kind of insane. And all the rest of it, I don't think, a lot of the 90s bands are really well revered and still remembered now. I don't see a lot of bands having that kind of resonance, or not in the same way. Yeah.
It's really fascinating that you mentioned that, because like I think about a song like American Idiot, by Green Day, which was like a comment and was like a criticism and had a message, right? They had a point of view. And like we're living in this time which is just politically so charged and tumultuous, and I don't see much happening. Like like Roar by Katy Perry is like has nothing to do with what's happening in America today. Like there's no political or kind of engagement on that level with some of the music today. I think that's what you're getting at.
There's a little bit of it, I think, out there, but no one's paying attention to it, and no one finds it to be critical. I mean, I remember when Eminem, I think, tried to do a anti-Trump song midway through Trump's first administration, and people were interested for a weekend, And I don't know if that's part of the way our society is so fragmented now. That cultural things that might have been phenomena back when we only had 3 channels to watch are just sort of like things to discuss. Oh yeah, the Dahmer show. All right, well that was kind of cool. What's on tonight?
Yeah.
Whereas I think the Dahmer miniseries would have been on the level of Roots, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
For anyone younger than us that doesn't remember, Roots. The miniseries of Roots, which came out in the 70s, was just a huge phenomenon, and people were glued to their TV for nights, 6 nights or something in a row. Like everyone had to see this thing, and I think it really made a lot of people appreciate slavery in this country in a way that they hadn't been aware of before.
Yeah, and there was a show, I don't remember what the name of it now, but do you remember the nuclear show?
It was like the day after or something.
The day after, yeah. And that was, again, a huge cultural touchstone. It was a really disturbing thing to be on network television. But now there's just so much content and information that you're right. And I don't know if that's part of it, right? Just the explosion of content and
I think it's a huge part of it.
Yeah. So, your book is called Anything But Nirvana. Right. Which has a double meaning, right? So
exactly,
it's partly about the fact that there were other bands besides Nirvana, which is the one that gets talked about so much, right?
The main inspiration for it was the fact that for many reasons, I interviewed a lot of the major bands of that era, not every single one, but a lot of them. But I never interviewed Nirvana. And there's a funny thing in the beginning of the book. I reproduced a rejection letter from an editor who is now famous, Jim DeRogatis, who's famous in the Chicago Trib, mainly related to the R. Kelly trials. He rejected my pitch about Nirvana, and in the letter he says Nirvana will be over in 6 months, or Nirvana will be over by 1992.
Wow.
So that's just, I just thought it was funny, and I got Jim's permission, and he thought it was funny too. But he also sort of begged off and said, well, one of my higher ups must have told me to say that, So I never interviewed Nirvana, which was a major thing. And part of the reason was because of my mindset as a writer, which was I wasn't necessarily interested in bands just because they were famous. I was only interested in writing about bands because I was interested in them, you know, which is not a good, unfortunately, it's not a great mindset to be as a professional anything, to be honest. You, as a professional musician, it's the same thing. You can't say, well, I'm just going to perform the music that I'm inspired by, you know?
Right.
I mean, God bless you and
Right.
good luck with that, you know, and you'll be playing places on the, you know, in the East Village for the rest of your career, which if you want to do, you can do that and you'll be respected by a very small amount of people, but that you're really limiting yourself. And
Right.
so in the same sense, being a music writer, if you only want to write about things you care about, you're going to be limited at a certain point, as I found out. But so I never interviewed Nirvana basically because it was just like, you know, it was like a dog pile trying to get a Nirvana story. And by the time I might have been able to do it, there was no prevailing reason why I should do it versus anyone else. And I didn't care that much either. So that's part of the reason. There's no Nirvana in this book. However, Nirvana comes up as a topic almost every other page. All of the other articles have some kind of reference or some sort of connection to Nirvana. And it's just fascinating that that became such a thread in that time period. And the other secondary message is that the 90s are sort of looked back on as this idyllic era, this rock era when everything was so great and innocent. And it's complicated. You know? I don't think, and it made me realize how history works and hagiography works. And it made me realize that you can look back at these eras and just want to say that they were idyllic and everything was great, but nothing's ever completely great and everything has a dark side, you know, to quote Kelly Clarkson.
Yeah. And so I want to explore that dark side a little bit, like some of the less nice things, like the less idyllic things that you discovered about these bands, and how they, you know, because, you know, in a way, of course, Nirvana was extremely successful, but Kurt Cobain has a very tragic story. So where's the disconnect there, and what's happening with these bands in terms of how they're making money and what's going on?
Yeah. So from the journalist perspective, really quickly, in that era, there was really a overriding sense of we just wanted to talk about the good things and how wonderful everything was. No one really wanted to get that far into the bad stuff, you know, the questionable things in the music industry. No one really wanted to get that deep into. They were very focused and obsessed on distribution and indie versus major, as if that was the whole story, you know, in terms of good versus evil, which it isn't the whole story at all, you know. And no one really wanted to look at behavior very much. They sort of talked about it behind the scenes, but no one wanted to call anyone out the way, you know, everyone in this book would have been canceled on some level by today's standards, you know, including me. You know, I kept some of the original language that I used in the 90s that would be questionable by today's standards because I thought it would be dishonest of me to delete it. But that's how people thought back then, good or bad, you know. And I think it's interesting to look not that far back in history and see how cultural mores change, you know. So that's the journalistic perspective. From the professional perspective, it's complicated to, you know, and my friend and another mentor, Martin Atkins, who was in Pigface and Ministry and Public Image Limited, and who put out my band's record, and I'm still very friendly with. He's in this book, in the Pigface article. He talks about the complications of the music industry all the time because he wants musicians to understand why it's how it's difficult and what you need to watch out for. And everything's changed since then, by the way, also in terms of the economics of it. But the economics of it are really hard. And when you want to be a musician, you don't really get into music to make $1 million, you know. And if you do, you're not going to be much of a musician, you know, because you're going to develop your music in a way that's just going to be sort of cynical, you know. You know, I don't believe even the biggest artists now really got in to do that, you know. So the business side of it is fraught with pitfalls and challenges. It started off as a, immigrant sort of backstreet, not respected industry, about 100 years ago or so, selling sheet music and selling records. And, so it was never sort of a properly run industry for a very long time until the 60s is when corporations started to get interested in it. Before that, it was run by a bunch of thugs and con men and who knows what. I mean, just people who barely knew what they were doing. And if they did, it was because they were stealing things from people, honestly,
Yeah.
The good guys didn't know what they were doing. The bad guys knew what they were doing and it was bad, So you have all these stories of the 50s and 60s of the music industry then just basically ripping off musicians who didn't know better because they had nothing to go on. I mean, even the Beatles were ripped off,
Right.
The Beatles were ripped off. And if the Beatles are going to get ripped off, what's the hope of your band, getting a fair shot, But also it's partially because no precedents were set really until the 70s. And even then there was all kinds of chicanery going on. There's things called breakage, and comps and the Columbia Music Club and all different ways of cheating artists out of the royalties that they were entitled to, and trying to keep record prices artificially cheap, which since the 70s, which has really messed up people's mindset of what you should be paid for in music. I like to point out that people will say, oh, records retailed for only $4 in the 60s, albums.
Yeah.
Well, $4 in the 60s is $40 today. So when you go into Urban Outfitters or Target or whatever and see a new piece of vinyl and you go, oh my God, it's $40. That's actually the price that it should be.
Right.
Price it should be. But we've had used records, which I'm a big used record guy, but we've also had, sort of artificially deflated pricing for decades, on music, and it's devalued music, that the price of albums is also was at a time when, 45s were the dominant thing. And that's why most kids in the 60s actually had 45 collections. They barely had any albums, until the album era, which is, sort of Sgt. Pepper onward,
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure if I got to answering your question, except that, if you're a musician out there and you think, wow, the business part of this is really hard and confusing, you're not alone.
Yeah.
It is. It is
right.
very, very confusing. And there are people all along the way, like it's a little board game, all along the way trying to steal from you.
Yeah, and that's so true. And with record sales, like you're right. The recording industry would have all kinds of ways, because who are you? Is Bob Dylan going to audit them? How does he find out if the percentage that they're paying him is really what they're making? Right.
Right. Which they did end up. So some of the bigger artists did end up doing, and they did find out they were cheating from them. Whether it was intentional or not is hard to, it goes case by case. But, there's definitely, the record business was set up to, obviously, it's an agreement. Whether you realize you're getting into the agreement or not, it's an agreement. The agreement is, I'm going to make you famous and I deserve payment for it. I watched the Elvis movie just recently, and obviously it's all about the relationship with Colonel Tom, and the crazy idea that Elvis just went 50-50 with Colonel Tom, which sounds insane.
Yeah.
Because Elvis didn't really value himself. There was no precedent for Elvis, really.
Right.
But he didn't value himself at that point. But also, when you think about it, here's a guy who says he's going to make me famous. I don't know. I don't have any other route. 50-50 seems like a fair deal.
Right. Right.
I mean, on paper. And then once he was famous, world famous, he probably thought, I mean, the guy did what he said he was going to do. How can I, how can I, it was fair enough, I think it was until later and he saw the industry develop and he realized, well, this is kind of a ridiculous deal that I made. but when you think about it in raw terms, it's not crazy,
Yeah. I mean, and there are ways that side musicians have been protected through like union recording contracts, for example. Right. And I have a story that is similar, right? So I got a call a few years ago. I was working in our electronic media division, and there's a famous drummer who played for Michael Jackson, right? And he called up his union because Michael Jackson had passed away. This movie called This Is It was out, right? And he called me up and he's like, "Hey, the band is all over this documentary. They shot like thousands of hours apparently when we were on tour." Mm-hmm. And so I looked into it and I said, "I'm so sorry, but there was no touring contract. You had no union protection on that tour. Like you got paid a lot of money up front, right? I'm sure they were making, $4 or $5 grand a week or whatever. But I'm like, we don't have any basis to get you any money for your visuals in this film. Like you were not protected for that."
Right.
And that's just one small example of like exploitation, right? Like, but it happens all the time, I think.
Well, and musicians are rarely educated on all the different elements of what your intellectual property are,
Yeah.
Because now it's, as you're explaining, it's not just about your performance. It's about, did you contribute to the songwriting in some way? And then that's a whole different tree of like where the values are in the songwriting. Are you performed in the moment? Were you being filmed? Okay. Did you sign away rights to being filmed or not?
Right.
That's a huge thing too. Then it comes down to, where can that film be used and how can it be used? Can it be remixed? Can it transformed into something? Can your performance be used for another performance? There's some, when we start to get into virtual performances now, and the things that happen in Vegas, like the Michael Jackson Cirque du Soleil show, it's incredible and very complicated. To think of how much value your performance has. And unfortunately, it also, if you obsess about it, it's going to take your mind away from honing your craft.
Right.
So, I've seen artists who are obsessed with the musical value of every single thing they do. And it's like your focus is taking away from you being a better artist. It's sad, it's complicated, right? I'm saying that it's very sad because I think, the best artists, hopefully they're protected, but sometimes they're not, but they've done amazing work. And then you think, wow, you didn't protect yourself at all, but you're the greatest, And I think probably in almost every case, we could look at who is the greatest in a certain genre. And I would almost be willing to guarantee to a one that they had bad deals.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right, because like, to be a creative person, you don't want to focus on all that other stuff. But at the same time, like you have to know like where the standards are, what the expectation should be. And I talk to students about this, and I talk to young musicians, like, did you even know that like if you're filmed, you have a right to have some compensation, right? If you're filmed or to have control over that, right?
You have some rights.
Yeah. And that if you're recorded, you actually have ownership over your performance, right? That other musicians have gotten paid when they've been recorded, right?
Right. I mean, you could be a session man and say this is it, but when you think about it in perspective, in the modern era, taking a session deal is not a good deal. That's the last thing you should do unless you're desperate for money,
And what is
you don't know, right? Like that session could become a B-side, so to speak, quote unquote, or it could not even make the album. Or it could become, like a Rolling Stone, and you're Al Cooper,
Yeah.
You got paid $1.50,
Yeah. And this is a huge problem, like, because I think what you're referring to as a session is like a buyout, right? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. And this is, people don't realize, like, I guess I'm trying not to be negative and cynical, but the scope of the greed of corporations is infinite, right? Like we're dealing
everything they can take,
Yeah, and so like in our, in the film industry right now, we have a lot of musicians who make their living playing for soundtracks, right? When you go see Star Wars, there's some amazing people that have played all that music, right?
Yep.
And all of our residuals, which is like how musicians make their money, which is on what they call the back end, in that world have traditionally been in what's called the secondary market, which is a foreign broadcast or the pressing of a CD or the making of a videotape or DVD. And if you've been paying attention, you probably realize all of those things are gone.
Right.
They don't exist. Right. And so you approach these employers like Disney and Paramount, and you say, hey, and NBC, and you say, hey, this isn't fair. We need to come up with a structure that's going to compensate musicians fairly for the work they're doing for you for this streamed content, which is only going to be streamed forever. And their answer is kind of like, screw off. Like, why should we, like, you know what I mean? It's just like, if
the deal was done, a deal was done is their perspective, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's very hard to renegotiate on things that have already been done, especially if you're not a key player, you know? If you're John Williams, you can renegotiate your deal.
Right.
And if you're John Williams insisting that the deal needs to be renegotiated for all of your musicians, maybe they'll come to the table. But
yeah.
John Williams, I would, and this is not a diss against John Williams personally. I don't know him personally, but I would scarcely doubt that he would go to the mat that way for all of the musicians, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, and nothing against him, but it's also a more complicated issue, which I don't have time to go into, but we've let composers kind of be out of our union circle, which is a problem, right? Like that's been a problem.
So they're not that is a big problem because it means they're not motivated to take care of musicians. You know?
Yeah. And they don't have a lot of power to do that, but
no.
Yeah.
They wouldn't anyway. Right.
Yeah. But my one of the things that I guess that were really a moment of clarity for me in life was I was in this room with all these bigwigs from every corporation, and they're lawyers, right? Who must be the highest paid lawyers in the world, right? They work for NBC and UCBS.
Yeah.
And working musicians were explaining this scenario that I just outlined for you about streaming only and stuff. And one of our working musicians, extremely competitive field. Like these are like the Yankee players of music, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ask this, set across the table, like, do you think that's fair? And the lawyer, the head lawyer for the motion picture and television industry said across the table, we're not here to negotiate what's fair.
Yeah, 100%.
I feel like that should just be on a T-shirt that I should give to everyone.
That's mind-blowing to someone who has a sense of wrong and right, but they are, especially a lawyer. For lawyers, it's not about fairness, especially if it's their job to tell for someone else. It's someone else's job to tell them what fairness is. It's not their job.
Right.
That's how most of you lawyers look at it. Lawyers are interpreters. Lawyers are, manipulator is a strong word, but they are interpreters, which means they will take what they've been handed and make the best of it they are advocates, that's literally the word for it, right? In other countries, an advocate. They are advocates for the people who have hired them. Now, if you said, hey, I'm going to hire you, sit on this side of the table, they're going to completely change their tone and they're going to be the one who says, this isn't fair.
Right, exactly.
That's who they are. And I think that's neither negative or positive. It's just that's who they are. And you have to understand that, and you have to understand that to speak on their language, So it's not about fairness. It's about equity, which is a different idea, right? It's about how can we get a deal that works for everyone from a negotiated perspective. And the importance with musicians is understanding your value. And that's the core of everything, I would say, in terms of being a professional musician on any level. Understanding your value. And look, if your value is not high, you should be honest about that too. sometimes your value is not that high, and you are very, very replaceable. And you should be honest about that and say, you know what, I got $20 for sawing a bow for half an hour. It's probably a good deal. That's fine. Let me not obsess about that and go back to, whatever else I'm doing. Or let me try and find a way of increasing my value. Why are the top seats, why are they considered the top guys, and how do I get there, because you could argue, I'm sure there's some musicians who don't think that's fair either, within the union. Why is it fair, that guy's valued more,
Yeah, it's a really broad and intricate and deep and wide question, right? And this is one that I think, for example, the symphonic industry is dealing with around equity and inclusion. And you say, well, we have an absolutely objective process of hiring, which is called the audition. And it just so happens that all of our musicians are Asian or white, right? Well, how do we address that? Because that's not the outcome we're looking for. But yet there is this process, right? So I think it's a complicated issue that industry is dealing with. But I think you're right. Like, there is, in the freelance world, like, there's a lot of you're only as, we have a saying that you're only as good as your last performance, right? Like, because you don't have tenure, you don't have job security, you don't have a full-time gig. You're always just going from gig to gig. And so getting that call is really important. And I think you're right about, like, being honest about your value, but I also think you have to understand what's real. Like, I've seen many musicians who just, they have this scarcity mindset. Like, right. Oh, well, if we were to ask for more money, they would just record us and replace us all. And it's like, well, they haven't done that yet, and they could do that at any time anyway. So is that real, or is that just you devaluing yourself out of fear?
Exactly. That's a big part of it. And part of the problem is, unfortunately, in some senses, live musicians aren't appreciated as much as they should be. And at least in this country, in this culture, I do think it's different in Europe. I think live musicians are appreciated more. Symphonic musicians are appreciated more. You see it within the fabric of just everyday life. I was in Prague about a month and a half ago, and there's just chamber concerts happening, and it's just buy a ticket and go to it. It's just a thing. It's just a neighborhood thing to have chamber concerts happening at places. And I don't know how popular they are, and I'm not saying those people are making a living even, but I'm saying that culture appreciates live musicianship more than it does here. Although conversely, we have the ticket pricing of superstars going absolutely out of control, between the whole Taylor Swift brouhaha and, everything that's been happening with Adele here in Las Vegas. I mean, these ticket prices are absurd. Yeah. They're insane. And for anyone to argue otherwise is just ridiculous. And I completely get the fact that artists have transferred to the whole calculus has changed from artists making money off of their recordings to artists making money off of live performances. Okay, I get that. That's actually going back to the way it was 100 years ago. Okay, before recordings were a thing, right?
Right, exactly.
So I get that, but that doesn't mean. And yes, Adele's wonderful. Okay, I still don't think she's Enrico Caruso. Forgive me.
Yeah.
I think she's a singular artist. I don't think she deserves a mortgage payment, or actually far beyond a mortgage payment.
Yeah.
To go see her perform. I think that much of that pricing is coming from the production values that are impressive, but I doubt that very many people who bought tickets to Adele are going to see the stagecraft. They're going to see Adele.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think that the idea of production has gone overboard, and that it speaks to the inflation of this thing, and also the whole corporate process of tickets, of ticketing and promotions and all that stuff. It's all gone way out of whack. It's all another version of trying to steal money from the artists.
Yeah.
Because yes. So now it's sort of like, well, we're still going to get our money. So if the artist wants to get their huge chunk, we're going to charge even more astronomical amounts. And I guess there are people out there who are willing to pay for it. Apparently there are, but that just speaks to the discrepancy of income in the society, you know?
Yeah. And I think the side musicians get screwed all the time in these deals too, because like
they always do. They're not getting paid any better.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you think about like somebody playing for, a nonprofit musical theater company out in the middle of Utah, let's say, they might make, I don't know, $100 a show as a side musician. And the ticket sales might be $50 to $75 a ticket. Right. And maybe the musicians on Adele are making $300 a show, but the tickets are $700.
Exactly. Right. It
doesn't line up.
It doesn't. Right. It's not to scale at all. And that's why I think this whole thing is very, very obnoxious, you know?
Yeah.
I don't have any power to change it. Even if I was writing, I don't think I would have any power to change it, you know? Because as long as people keep buying the tickets, they'll keep charging that amount, you know? As long as people buy enough of the tickets, you know? The issue with Taylor Swift wasn't that the tickets were too expensive. The issue was that they sold out too fast.
Right.
That's insane.
Yeah.
You know?
And
I spent $10 to see the best show I ever saw in my life, which was The Clash at Bonds, you know, in 1981. It was $10. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? So let's go crazy and say that's $50 in today's money.
Right.
You know?
Wow. Well, and you know, I have a similar feeling about the restaurant world, right? And you're in that world too, but where like I was really excited about molecular gastronomy in the mid 2000s and what was happening with modern cooking, especially in Chicago. And then it just became so obscenely expensive that I'm like, well, this person doesn't care about bringing what they do to a wide audience. They just care about feeding the 1%. And I feel the same way about like some of these ticket prices for like events, right? Like for artists. And it's probably not the artist's fault, as you say, but it's just a combination.
I'm not saying it's not the artist's fault.
Yeah.
Because I think the artist should be accountable for it regardless. I still think an artist, as well as a chef, should be aware of how much the price is of entry to see them. And they should definitely be thinking, do I think this is reasonable? Not, will people pay it? You know?
Right.
But the will people pay it is the same thing as the lawyer saying, we're not here to discuss what's fair.
Right.
You know, it's another fairness thing, you know? So an artist who doesn't care, and this came down when it was about Bruce Springsteen, you know, Mr. Everyman, which is, I think, always been a con anyway. In fact, one of the first published things I ever wrote was in New Jersey, and it was ripping apart Bruce Springsteen's image. It was one of the first things I ever got published, actually. So I've always sort of thought that I don't hate him as an artist, but I've always thought his image was kind of baloney. So he was torn apart for his ticket prices too, you know, and it's sort of like, how much money do you need, you know?
Right.
But I don't, you know, I think it's good that all that stuff is being scrutinized, but I don't know if the genie isn't out of the bottle, so to speak, you know?
Yeah.
I think that what needs to happen is there needs to be more great music on a street level, so to speak, so that people don't care about, oh, I've got to go see Adele or I've got to go see Taylor Swift. I would much rather, you know, there's a few places where that happens. New Orleans is a great example. There's so much great street level music, you know, that if an expensive show comes in there, you can just say, well, I'm just going to go see these guys down the street because they're great. And I'm going to have a great night and it's going to cost me $100 all in, you know?
Right.
That's what we need. We need more of that. But, you know, I don't, you know, it's great for me to say that out loud. I'm not sure how that happens. It probably goes back to music in the schools and local entities appreciating music as an important part of the culture and supporting that and subsidizing that in a better way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these are things we've talked about for decades, and we seem to be actually getting farther away from them, not closer.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a big issue, and I think Las Vegas oddly has a pretty decent public school music system. They at least have a policy of making sure every kid has an instrument, right? Because that was a big barrier for a lot of kids. If you couldn't afford to rent an instrument, like you couldn't be in band.
Right.
Some of the instruments are not the greatest quality, but at least every kid has an instrument. But getting back to what you said, like I think that's really crucial. It's like a democratizing kind of thing, right? Like, and I think there is this idea that like with Adele, and I would even argue with certain chefs and restaurants, like is the theater and the production overtaking the substance, right? And so I stopped eating at some of these restaurants when the pricing got outrageous. And also when I had a visit and I was like, the first time I came here, this was really about the food. And this just feels all about theater and technique. Like somebody said, we want to charge X amount of dollars. So what do we have to do to meet that price versus is this what we should charge? Right?
I don't think you're wrong. And it's interesting to go back to my trip to Prague. I went to 2 Michelin 1-star restaurants in that city, and they were starkly different. One of which, both of them were, excellent. They hit all those service points. They hit all those creativity points. But one of them, which was actually the lesser price-wise, the food was delicious and satisfying. And the other one, the food was overly lavish. Every single course was showy and had those molecular kind of things. And I like that stuff, but I don't like every single course. Every single course is like you're pushing it,
Yeah.
And it was just, the meal was just kind of overly rich and unsatisfying. And I actually told them that, and it was really an interesting contrast between the two. And I think that's true across the industry. And it's funny, this movie, The Menu, that I just saw last night,
I'm dying
to a certain extent in a very dark comedy sense. I highly recommend it to anyone who loves food. But the food world is interesting. I think that, yes, some chefs they want to explore it as an artistry, and they're not so concerned about just making people happy because they feel like there's other people doing that. There's loads of other people doing it and doing it well. So I think it's okay in food and music for an artist or a chef to say, I'm not looking to just satisfy you or please you. I'm exploring artistry, Yeah. I mean, a great example, just in my mind from my era, even though she's not in the book, I wish there was an example in the book, but Diamanda Glass, from the 90s era, and sort of, I assume she's still around. Or Nick Cave, who is in the book, might be a good example, not quite as extreme. He's doing what he wants to do. If you're into it, fantastic. He loves you. If you're not, that's okay. Go next door, go see a Tom Jones show, or go see, U2 or whoever else pleases you. It's fine. It's not like the fancy restaurant is the only place where you can get a meal,
Right.
So I think it's okay as long as the expectations are set, as long as Diamanda Glass is going to say, hey, I'm not covering Freebird,
Right.
This is not Adele, for example. This is an artistic exploration. And I think it's fine with other restaurants, but I think that a lot of people don't really understand that, and they're not made to understand that. For an Alinea, for example, or a Saison in San Francisco, or something like that, or however many other examples, as opposed to Blue Hill, where you and I dined, where it was very well done. It was very technique driven, but it was still a delicious and recognizable meal, you know?
Yeah. And it wasn't like, it's so interesting because like I think those two chefs are really both extremely talented, but so different. Like at Blue Hill, you don't see the technique. You just see this. It's not about the ego of the chef. It's just about the food. And at Alinea, it's very
ingredient inspired.
Yeah. And I have to say that the meal that I had that changed my life was at a restaurant called WD-50 in New York City.
Wiley Dufresne, yeah.
Wiley Dufresne's restaurant. And I went there and had a multi-course dinner. And the first thing I ate was a terrine made with foie gras, white anchovy, and unsweetened chocolate. And I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like a joke, right? I'm like, why would anybody do this? And then I put it in my mouth and was like, this is amazing. And I never would have expected it. And it's also Martian. It's like from another planet, right? And then I really started researching. And then I actually went to Alinea the month that they opened in 2005.
Oh, wow.
And I had an amazing meal. I've been back a few times since over the years, maybe 4 times total. And every meal I had after that was more disappointing, frankly. And so, and I just wonder if it's like cubism in painting. Is it reaching a wall? Is there just nowhere else for it to go? Do we? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but
well, you know, I mean, I do think, and again, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do. And it's challenging when you have a venture that is, I assume, profitable. I assume if Alinea, which is, you know, fine dining and it's hard to be profitable in fine dining, but I assume if they weren't profitable, they wouldn't keep doing it. It's hard when you're doing something profitable to say, I'm just going to stop. You know, I guess Ferran Adria did that, and God bless him, you know, it was very hard, but, you know, I do think that there is something in, it's funny because we've been looking at the Beatles so much lately, and I'm a Beatles fan, and so we've been looking at that, you know, a lot. When the Beatles, you know, after Sgt. Pepper, you know, and then they did Magical Mystery Tour, and they kept doing the psychedelia, and then after about 8 months of that, they were like, nah, we're done. That's it. We're going totally different direction, and you know, and from there we're going to break it down even more. You know, I saw some piece where when they were describing the Let It Be project, I think John Lennon apparently said to George Martin, and this might be apocryphal, but he was like, we want to do an honest record, not one of your things, you know, which was sort of obnoxious because John Lennon was sort of obnoxious many times in his life, you know, sort of obnoxious because John Lennon's best records, period, or almost to a one, are highly produced affairs, you know. I mean, Strawberry Fields Forever is as much George Martin's record as it is John Lennon's record, and it's the best, probably the best thing he's ever done. You know, I mean, yeah, I know some of his solo stuff was much more stripped down, but you know, it's incredible. So for John Lennon to say, you know, I wanted to make an honest record, and George Martin's apparent response was, I thought they were all honest records, you know. You know, it's just obnoxious. And of course, the irony of this actually all comes from an article that was posted by Mikkel Gilmore, who's another artist, another writer I really admire. He posted this just maybe yesterday, actually. You know, and the irony is that the final version of Let It Be, at least at the time, was more overproduced than George Martin ever would have done with it, thanks to Phil Spector, you know. So it was even more dishonest, you know, that it's a quote unquote George Martin record, you know. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that oh, God knows what the point was I was trying to make. The point is that I think chefs, much like musicians, need to have chapters. They need to change what they're doing. They need to, in order to keep growing, they need to keep doing different things and challenging themselves in different ways. Whatever way that is up to them to decide. But they need to keep challenging themselves in order to move forward. You know, that Wiley Dufresne, to his credit, closed down WD-50, which, you know, I don't know, maybe because it wasn't profitable, but if he brought it back now, it'd probably be massive. And he's been doing a bunch of different sort of funky projects. The last thing I saw was like hot donuts, I think.
Donuts, yeah.
I'm not sure what, I think he's doing something else now. You know, James Trees, who I work with, has a ton of different projects in mind. He's not just sort of repeating himself. He doesn't want to repeat himself. As far as I know, there's never going to be another Esther's Kitchen. Not that anyone else besides us knows what that is.
Right.
He wants to keep trying different projects and, you know, growing to a certain extent. He's already done a ton of different stuff in his career, you know. And I think that should be true of musicians too. If you really want to grow, you've got to keep challenging yourself and trying different things, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, I think that's a really great place for us to maybe close the curtain on this conversation, because I know you have other things to do today. But it's been a joy to have you on, and I hope you come back, because I feel like we could talk for 2 more hours.
I'd love to. We barely even talked about the book, but that's okay. Oh, looks like your audio went down. What happened?
Sorry, I'm back. I just muted myself by accident.
Oh, okay.
No, I was going to say, how can people find you and connect with you, and also buy your book? Where can they find it?
So you can find me on Instagram at EC Gladstone, like my last name.
Okay.
You can find the book on Amazon. There it is.
Anything But Nirvana. Yep.
It's available on Amazon, print to order, or there's one local shop in here in Vegas called Ava Pop that's carrying it. And yeah, that's basically the easiest ways to find me, I think. Yeah, and thefeastoffriends.com is the home of my marketing company. We work with a bunch of different restaurant and bars here locally in Las Vegas.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for being my guest this week, and we'll definitely have you back on, because I think there's about 5 different things we could have talked about that we didn't, and want to hear more about your foray into music, but also your work in marketing and PR, because that's a big issue for musicians, is how to frame themselves, their stories. So looking forward to having you back soon, and thank you again for being my guest this week, and we will see everybody next time. Take care.
Thanks, Michael. It's fun.
Thanks.